when you get people together in ways that are participatory, that have a very clear purpose, and that kind of repeat, over time, that is like a trust building machine.
Welcome, everyone. I am so excited to be here today with Diez. Luis, welcome to What the Fundraising.
This is amazing. Thanks so much, Mallory. It's such a pleasure to be here with you and with everybody that follows you.
Oh, well, I'm really excited for this conversation. I loved chatting the first time that we met, and I love what you're doing, particularly over at the Donor Participation Project. So I have a feeling we're going to have a really exciting conversation today. So why don't we start with just you sharing a little bit about yourself, what brings you to your work today?
Oh my goodness. So what my work has recently changed quite a bit. So I have to say I'm as excited as ever, but it's kind of, I was telling you just before the show started, Mallory, we were chatting and I was telling you, I don't really know what to tell people that I do. Like, they tell you at parties, oh, and what do you do? And the other day they asked me that and I was like, oh, I'm a fundraiser, but then I guess I'm a consultant now, but I also have this community. But what's a community? That's really weird. I'm really excited about, the way things are happening, where we are in the world. And, maybe you agree, Mallory, like just the possibilities that social media and communications have made available for every nonprofit and for all of us. I just have a kind of a hard time putting a name on it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, tell everyone a little bit about your identity, even as the fundraiser side of it. Like, tell folks a little bit about what your fundraiser journey has looked like.
So I was in music school and I had no idea what I was going to do. So I got a bunch of internships in New York. I lived in a relative's basement for a summer and I kind of fell in love with fundraising. I was with a consulting firm and I was at Lincoln Center for a bit. Nothing glamorous. I was actually just like moving stands around and serving coffees. Like everybody has a very weird journey to get into fundraising, right? So I discovered fundraising as kind of a wonderful place that mixes mission with the business part. And if you're technical, there's a technical part. If you're a people-oriented part, and I know you're a coach, I felt like it was like a microcosmos that there's something for everybody in fundraising. If you're passionate about it. So that kind of kicked off a journey. I went into higher ed. I was a fundraiser there. I kind of followed the boss and then I got recruited and then I ended up at Hopkins and I was with the Baltimore Symphony for a while, and everywhere kind of, I never really could find my place in the world, honestly, because, I knew I didn't want to be just a major gifts fundraiser. And in lots of shops, especially kind of the larger, more supposedly sophisticated shops, that's the path. You become a major gift fundraiser and you eventually lead a team, eventually you lead the whole place, or lots of people would like to. And that wasn't really my thing. I was always kind of in the intersection of community building. I had lots of very good success kind of bringing people together, getting people that weren't giving to give, getting people that were giving modestly but had capacity to give a lot more. We raised a lot of money, but it wasn't kind of like your typical fundraiser. So that has kind of been the path. My most recent place of service was Muhlenberg College, which is a college in Eastern Pennsylvania, an amazing community. And I learned so much there from the team and from everybody. We were able to, as a ranking of the schools who give the most, whose alumni give, we were able to grow that ranking. So that was amazing, especially during, the pandemic and the decline in donors everywhere. And that was great. And and then in the middle of all of that, I started that community that I think you and I connected over, the Donor Participation Project. So that's about it.
Okay, I love it. And you highlighted something that I've actually been thinking about a lot lately, like the way in which we define fundraising and what we know about fundraising success or research. When I look at sort of the science behind when donors give and how donors give, it's based on so many things that are not in that moment between the fundraiser, like in a major gifts interaction, and the donor, right? It's based on all these community elements. It's based on all this other marketing, all this other communications that are happening all year round. And I feel like, and I'm just really curious about your thoughts around this, I've been thinking so often that we have this one conversation around how we don't want to be transactional, right? We don't want our fundraisers to be transactional. And yet we define their work in a situation like what you're talking about as actually just the transaction. We're saying, oh no, but because that work is community building, and that work is in the marketing department, and that work is this other thing. And so, but those are the pieces that when combined make it a transformational experience for the donor. And so like, what kind of harm are we doing disconnecting all those pieces that I think you were actually like, they shouldn't be connected. And I believe in sitting at the intersection of these two components. And I believe in that a lot too. And I'm just curious what you think even about me saying that, or if you agree.
Oh my goodness, I think you're so right. And in all of that situation, which you described, we're glorifying the asker, the solicitor, and that's the person who gets to progress in their career and eventually lead the shop. So I find that interesting. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, and there's a tremendous amount of merit. And I've made I've done my visits and my proposals and my asks and all of that. It was just that piece that you were just reflecting on, the disconnect that really had me, and I was talking with a colleague the other day, and he said, well, probably, I don't know if there's any science behind this, but probably the success of an ask is about 20% in the ask itself and 80% in the everything else, the stewardship, the community, the trust building, all those comms that people really don't, well, what's the ROI on this? Well, it has an impact. So I think what we're missing is not so much like super solicitors as strategists. Like the people who think about the structure, no?
Yeah. And the integration of it. I mean, I think like when I hear things like, oh, we're cutting marketing, I'm like, what does that mean? Like you're cutting all these other communications that typically go out to your donor population, and you're expecting your major gift officers to raise the same amount of money when all of a sudden they're not going to see all of this other stuff all year round. And I agree with you. I often ask like, okay, you're putting together a major gift campaign. What was happening 10 months ago in terms of your communication with this group of people? I don't know the science around kind of the percent in the room. I would say I really agree with that when the answer from the donor is a yes. Like, I think when the answer is a no, maybe there was more at play in that specific interaction between the major gift officer and the donor. Like if something really, but I think you're right. When a donor says yes, it's because of all of these other pieces. And that was just like the final leg of a marathon, essentially. And that's really interesting what you said about the glorification part. What does that mean then for, or what do you feel like that's doing to other folks who are supporting the fundraising engine at these big shops, but not getting the recognition or mobility opportunities or things like that? What's the impact of that?
So that's kind of totally why we created the donor participation project. All those, like I call them donor operations people, in a for-profit firm, they would be the revenue operations or the marketing operations teams or the sales operations teams. There was definitely a feeling and a need for, we're kind of not appreciated. We need to support each other. And also kind of, we've discovered that there are incredible careers that are happening even right now in people that are in fundraising, development, advancement, whatever you want to call it, that are out of the mold. The orchestra conductor who went on to be the executive director of an art center, who is now a technology consultant. All types of, really, people are designing their careers in very different ways. And, that's, I find that kind of cool. But I have to say the situation isn't easy on anybody. Like, so think of our proverbial very kind of road warrior, major gifts focused career. what you just described, like let's cut marketing, what that means for them is that they're going to show up at the doorsteps of people who don't really know or trust the organization. So that means that that's going to push back their development, their cultivation work, for as long as it takes to build that trust, so 6 more months, 8 more months, with all the pressure that we all know that we have. So the thing is, so it definitely has an impact, but it's harder to measure, right?
Yeah.
The impact of those things, like palms, like remember when everybody said, oh, let's stop doing physical mailings because we'll do emails. That didn't work either.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I feel like one of the other challenges in fundraising is that, and this is something I appreciate because I feel like I see the donor participation project stepping into the space with a lot of nuance, and with a lot of, curiosity around certain things and certain conversations, which I just feel like is so important, because when we get these, when we get this one size fits all advice that doesn't offer any support for how to integrate this into our organization, or even how to think about it through the lens of our organization, we kind of see this split between, I feel like I both see folks who are like, well, what did Charity Water do? I want to do what Charity Water did. And then they want to sort of just replicate. Or when a suggestion is made around something like, oh, well, that won't work for us because we're special in this way. And so it's like, we get this sort of both and world. And so how do you think about for folks who are okay, we want to do a better job around donor participation. We want to do a better job around, integrating these different elements, understanding the ways in which they relate to each other. And particularly for our organization, perhaps, what's some of your advice around how they can even sort of enter that exploration as an organization?
That's a really good question, because the topic itself is super complex, potentially, right? And there's kind of a cheap way to do it, which is not the way that we hopefully stand for. So, but you could start saying, well, I'm going to start selling widgets, and $1 out of each widget is a donation, and then bam, that number goes up, right? But if you want to do it with quality, and if you want to actually include participation, so the feeling of people participating in you, not just kind of throwing $1 at you, which is what eventually is going to help you attract the type of people that stay with you, and those are the types of people who, like you'll probably say, end up wanting to make major gifts, legacy gifts, pine gifts, etc. Right? So, and that's the way that everything comes together. So one way to think about this is that from the trust perspective. So, if usually trust is kind of required, right, before making a gift. If somebody's making a gift without trust, then it's probably the type of gift that's going to be very hard to retain. So, okay, there's an emergency now, and now everybody, that they don't really know your organization or feel connected with it. So those gifts are always harder to retain. Not to say that they're not needed or they're not good in their moment and they serve their function, right? So, and what types of things improve trust? And I did a whole lot of research, and actually community building, group decisions are among the best possible ways to increase trust. Things that don't work are things like ads, your typical, marketing, your one-way comms, where this is about us and we're great and look at all our need, etc. But when you get people together in ways that are participatory, that have a very clear purpose, and that kind of repeat, over time, that is like a trust building machine. And then, you still need to ask people. And, I think that's an approach that's much more holistic. So yes, it's complex because there are lots of different ways to go about it. But I think the path, whatever it is kind of in that direction. Does that make sense?
Yes. And okay, can we unpack trust a little bit together? When people are trusting an organization, what is that in the way that you're defining it here? What does that mean they believe about the organization?
That's a really good question. And I was looking into it for a while. And in fact, I'm researching it for a post that I'm writing. But I was, so there's lots of different pieces to trust. McKinsey has a really good model because they actually were very purposeful. So McKinsey is a huge consulting firm, right? I don't know how much they bill every year globally, some atrocious number of billions of dollars. Okay. And they were very intentional about building trust because, they thought probably rightfully that trust is the basis of their work. They're consultants. People need to trust them. And they actually put it into a formula. It's kind of a gimmick, but everybody please bear with Mallory and me. So the trust equation from McKinsey starts with credibility. So are you good at your work? So are nonprofits, is the nonprofit equipped to actually solve the problem? Do you have the experts? I would say like a lot of the traditional nonprofits, hospitals and universities, and don't have that problem, right? People still think that they're credible, although that's being questioned, right? People do question the science and the medicine and that type of thing. Number two, reliability. Okay. If you say you're going to do something, do they believe that you're going to do it? I would say here, I know lots of nonprofits that struggle, just calls that come in and never get answered, or, get answered very late. Announcements that the annual report will go out next month and that never happens. Things like that, right? So reliability. And I feel like not enough nonprofit leaders are thinking about it from that perspective, that trustworthy. The third factor that McKinsey developed in their model is intimacy. So how many shared values do we have? Do I dress and look like you? And that's why consultants if they're consulting for the construction industry, will look like they belong there. And if they, and to some extent fundraisers too, right? If you're going to do sports fundraising, you're not going to wear your bow tie. So that intimacy, do I talk? Do I share do I look like I share your values, et cetera, et cetera? Again, lots of potentially I can see how that could be problematic, and we have our equity and diversity, we sure know in the profession. And finally, self-orientation that goes in the opposite direction of everything else. So the other things, the more you have, the better, right? The more credible you are, the more reliable you are, the more intimacy, whatever, however you describe that, you have better. But self-orientation is like, how much do you care about yourself versus caring about the other person? Like if you go to a doctor, you presume that they care, about you and your outcome. And, that they're or a priest or, somebody, so that they're, the orientation is hopefully about your needs. If they're self-oriented, you don't trust them as much because you think, oh, the doctor probably wants to bill more hours. So that's why, or get another surgery in. And that's why they're doing this versus because of a need I really have. So those are the pieces of trust. I have to say it's a work in progress. As you just saw, I actually had it open in a tab, but it's interesting, no?
Really interesting. It brings up this piece, and you can tell me if you do not want to explore this with me. But I have been thinking a lot about the sort of donor-centric, community-centric conversation. And I rely a lot of my practice on the science of human behavior, the psychology, both of the donor and the fundraiser. And, research like that is like incredibly important and meaningful. And I hear you say that piece around sort of self-orientation. Yeah, that piece around the self-orientation. And I can imagine that some people would say, oh, but if you have it be too much about the donor, then there you are being sort of donor centric again and heroizing them and, leaning into some of the like white savior narratives. I happen to believe that there's a way, like when you say that to me, what I hear is that actually the problem that we see more than anything, in my opinion, is the nonprofit talking about itself and like just talking about itself through the lens of everything that it knows and everything it cares about. And oftentimes actually completely excluding even the community it's supporting in those communications. It's like the self is the nonprofit self, right? And so, and that the communications doesn't help anyone feel seen or included, and that it's not about making the donor the like savior, but that there's a way to communicate through that includes the donor's lens, that helps communicate from the perspective of the donor, that's like a human-centric way of fundraising that is taking into account this very real and important research and doing it in a community-based and inclusive and equitable and just way. Like, I believe there's something in the middle, and I'm curious, like, where, like, how you feel about that conversation.
Okay, I'm no expert in any of this, and I'm fumbling around as much as anyone. So I just want to give that caveat. Yes, exactly. So self-orientation, I think you're totally on the money with nonprofits, say usually focused on their own needs. I mean, I'm also a big believer in actually listening to our donors, and what do donors very often say? You only want me for my money. You know, well, if, you know, and I've been inside the nonprofit, and I know how unfair that felt. And it's like, no, we talked to you a lot of times besides, you know, about other things besides asking you, but, you know, well, there's the perception, and there may be something in what we do that, you know, strengthens that. I tend to believe that most people are good and want the best thing, not only for themselves, but for others. So, you know, to some extent, it's not just saying, you know, like, you, it's all about you. You know, that other person has lots of dimensions to their personality, right? So they may have a selfish dimension, and that's kind of where that white saviorism and those horrible donors come to mind. But in most people, there's a stronger element that they want what's best for their community. And that's the orientation that we want to appeal to, right? So we're saying, look, you care about this issue, you care about the streets of our neighborhood. And I think that's what that kind of orientate, you know, the self versus the other person's orientation kind of falls. People are complex, there's lots to them. I think also that maybe sometimes nonprofits do things that bring out the worst in the donor, like, you know, pandering behaviors. So I don't think it's black and white. You know, I think we also draw a little bit from the other person. And I think that a lot of this community building, in the sense that I've come to understand it, I don't know that it's exactly the same as in the community-centric movement, tends to mitigate those bad things, you know, tends to kind of emphasize what the group needs and things like that. So yeah, I don't know. It's very nuanced, and it's a hard conversation.
I know, but you know what? I really appreciate you going there, because I think the reality is that the most meaningful and effective, and like ultimately the path forward that's going to help us accomplish the goals that nonprofits are trying to accomplish, is going to require some nuance, and it's going to require some uncomfortable conversations, and it's going to require us to talk about things and say, hey, what about this? Like, does this cause harm, or how does this feel for our donors? I mean, I think that, you know, when we try to like stay in just a place of comfort fundraising, then we're doing status quo fundraising. Like, we're not going to actually get better, be more innovative, engage our donors differently without some level of discomfort, because that's just what happens from trying something new. The piece you said that I just really want to double click on for folks who are listening to this is that, because I think you hit on something that I've been like talking around for a while, but haven't really had the like language or research, is that piece around that when you're rooted in alignment around your values and what you're trying to do, it doesn't actually have to be you-centric or me-centric, it's us-centric. And what we're saying is, we know you care about blank, we care about that too. And so it actually gets to be in that like gray space, that it's not about us and it's not about you. And it's not that like white savior, harmful behavior. And we're not just like being in our own little bubble, like, we're a nonprofit, we need this. You have money. We don't have money. Can you give us some of your money? Right? It's like, we actually want to have the same thing. But I fundraised like that for a long time. That was how I was taught to fundraise, basically, was like asking board members to open their Rolodex. Who do you know who has money? Try to make the case around why you deserve some of that money. And that was it, and feel super uncomfortable in the process, but never talk about it. And never really like tapping into, wow, actually, because I believe what you believe about humans, that so many people actually want the same thing. They might not know how to create that same thing. They might not know the path to that, how they can participate in that, what it looks like to feel like they belong in that community. Are they going to feel safe in that community? But it doesn't mean they don't want what you want.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's kind of putting ourselves in the feet of others. What you just said resonated with me. They don't know if they're going to feel wanted or welcome in that community. I think that applies to everybody. So, even our high net worth individual donors. Yeah, I really like how you framed it, of coming at it more from like a partnership perspective. Which I think sets a very different power dynamic. And maybe like the pandemic helped with that, because we were like in people's kitchens, through Zoom.
Yeah, I agree.
Versus the superpower thing where you go into somebody's boardroom and they sit you at the very end and you have to make your case. And I was just like feeling the shivers, because I've been there too. It's so, I have another topic for you after.
Give it to me. Give it to me.
Okay, following the line of these like slightly controversial topics, overhead.
Oh,
yay. Let me share a little bit of background, and hopefully people have a way of getting back to you or me and sharing their thoughts. But that's another space where I feel like there's an opportunity for a more nuanced conversation around that. And I've really been on both sides of the equation. People are very firm in their ideas, but there seems to be some studies where telling people, where if you solicit people and you tell them that overhead is paid for by somebody else, you raise a lot more money. And I was always surprised by these studies, right? And I can send you a link afterwards, Mallory, and if we want to share that. And there's one in Science magazine, and it was like double. So like you raise not only double the amount of dollars, but double the amount of donors. Versus saying you're going to use money for a match, or using that you're going to use it as seed money. There's lots. So immediately where people come at this is, well, we have to educate donors. And I want to kind of approach this like more as a conversation starter, but this is another place where people are like no, we have to educate. I'm not even going to like think it through. We're just never going to do that. To me, like in an industry that is essentially declining by number of donors, I feel like we need to have those hard conversations. And, is there a way to educate and also get a similar message out? In general, when donors, there are studies that show that when donors are asked to give to an organization with high overhead versus low overhead, they give less to the low overhead organization because they think they're getting smarter. So it's like, it's confusing, right? So what does that mean? Like they like overhead, but they don't want to pay for it. So essentially what they're, and so then what does that mean? What does that mean for our major donors, who essentially often get an overhead free experience? Like they get to make a restricted gift, and that 100% of that goes to the cause. But then we ask our more modest donors to support the overhead. Is that fair? I'm just very, I see lots of angles to it.
Yeah, I really appreciate this conversation. I certainly feel like I'm probably one of the people who's come out pretty strong in support of certain elements of donor education. Although I would say that I tend to talk a lot about the major donor conversation around it, like what to say in the room with that donor, because I actually feel like that's the biggest opportunity to really shift understanding of overhead and the narrative around, like, I think what you were saying before around sort of pandering to donors. I think like we don't often in those major donor conversations just open up a conversation around the impact of what even that overhead is that we're talking about, right? And like, we don't create those more nuanced conversations. And I feel pretty strongly that that's a place for really dynamic and interactive education around it. I also think the other piece is, you and I have very, very different fundraising experiences. Like, you've worked in these big shops with big overhead. I've worked in these really like small, mid-sized organizations with nowhere near enough overhead to support the work that we were doing. And so I think this is the other place that it's really complicated, is that it's not one size fits all. Overhead, and even how we determine overhead, what we call overhead, those look so different in different places. And so I think what we need is more nuanced education. We don't just need more posters that say overhead is good, but we need more nuanced conversations around like, what is happening, what's the purpose of nonprofits, what's happening inside of them, and like, what is the reason for all of these different elements, perhaps. I also think, this other point that you're making, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that sometimes, and Vic Harrison and I have had a few conversations about this, like offline, that I'm just going to bring online, but because I do worry sometimes about really influential nonprofits having big campaigns around a lack of overhead, because I worry that reinforces the language that we shouldn't have overhead, and that as like an umbrella statement can be dangerous, right? And so like, when we as a sector or organizations in the sector are perpetuating 100% model campaigns, I do believe it can be harmful to people's education around the nonprofit sector. However, the conversations her and I have had in there, which I also really understand and see, is like, the 100% model is a marketing campaign. It's like understanding that a certain group of your donor base don't necessarily understand overhead, and you're not going to be able to educate them and change their opinion about that in a certain amount of time. And so, but there is a way to really positively engage them in your mission. And so why not build a program or one fundraising part of your engine that can share that message in a way that's compelling, engaging, creates participation, and have your overhead covered everywhere. And I actually agree with that for a charity water who has also created a 0% program, right? Like, they have the well. And so what I wish they were talking about more is how they did that. And what I wish organizations were saying more of was, how did they build that? How did they have conversations with major donors to give 0% to programs? That's what's interesting to me. Like, that's the wisdom.
I'm with you.
Right. And so I think it is nuanced.
Totally
it's like, talk to me.
And I'm learning so much from you today, Mallory.
I think I really appreciate you bringing it up and saying, okay, it's not just like this battle of like no overhead, or like overhead is good or overhead is bad. It's like, we do need to have more of these nuanced conversations around it. It is super important. And I mean, I deal with this in my business too, right? Like, I think a lot in my business around my own marketing and how my marketing might impact the sector. Like, the last thing I ever want in my marketing is to do something that makes fundraisers feel more anxious or overwhelmed or worried. Even if it meant I would sell my course more, for example, it's not worth it to me, because I'm thinking about the whole sector orientation. And so I don't want to cause harm. Sometimes I definitely I've done that wrong. I haven't known what to do, or you know what I mean? I've made mistakes there, but it's something I'm really mindful of. In the nonprofit sector, we don't have a lot of conversation around like, what is sector-wide responsibility versus organizational responsibility. And I don't think everyone agrees on that. And so I recognize that I'm saying, I don't think it's good for the sector when big 100% model campaigns are run, but is it good for those organizations? Yes. And is it my place to say that they should have a sector-wide orientation? I can wish maybe they did, but it's not my place to like, you know what I mean? And so I just do think it's more complicated than we give it credit for.
And you mentioned, it did come back at the end. You mentioned that how everybody's perspective and experience with fundraising informs how they come into these conversations. And I find that a lot of the pushback against this especially comes from organizations that, to me, feel like they do a lot of fundraising from foundations and grants, where definitely, yes, you need to push back. There's a lot of education and lobbying to do, probably in a very public way, because that's what moves them. They're not individual donors. So that's also kind of another thing I noticed. And, I loved how you compared both of our experiences. I think another of those sector-wide things that people don't think about, and that is affecting the number of people giving to nonprofits, is trust. Again, going back to our conversation earlier, right? So lots of nonprofits do things that might maximize their returns in the short term, but that reduce trust in the sector. I know you're not going to hold every nonprofit accountable for what they do, but over time, I think it's adding up. And I don't know how we solve that.
Yeah, I totally agree. I was speaking recently at some event, and it just sort of came out of my mouth in a response to someone. I was like, we are stewarding each other's donors, period. Like most donors are giving to 5 to 7 nonprofits, and we're stewarding each other's donors. And so how we treat them impacts everybody. And I think like what we've seen a lot recently, and I wonder if you've explored this in the donor participation project, is like, I feel like there are new opportunities for generosity that perhaps didn't exist 10 years ago, for expressing your values and for expressing generosity, be it B Corps or, like what we saw with Ukraine using Airbnb.org or Etsy to buy digital art, like the diversity in ways that we as humans get to connect and be generous and solidify that piece of our identity has really grown. And so that then creates this interesting question around, like, when people are leaving or, not showing up to nonprofits in a time of crisis, but seeking out other ways to make a positive impact. What does that say about how they've been treated here?
Yeah, treated. And, again, do they believe that nonprofits are the best way to solve it? Ease of use, people giving directly on Facebook. So, I don't think there's any doubt that the human spirit, and especially the spirit in this country, is exceptionally generous, probably as generous as ever. It's just that the ways are changing, which I guess is kind of another conversation. Like, are nonprofits the best structure for our needs nowadays versus what they were in the past? But I think that's like 3 or 4 more podcasts with smarter people.
That's probably a whole series. Yeah. And I think just like with everything else, the answer is sometimes and sometimes not, and like, I think there's no kind of one size fits all there. And yeah, I think it's good for us to be open. And I think sometimes the nonprofit sector can get, and I was definitely in this camp, a little bit self-righteous at times. I think this is what makes our communication very like tunnel visioned around our own perspective, is we are like a little bit on our high horse about the work that we do. And we don't recognize that like the way that feels to donors or comes off to donors, or that it's doing the exact opposite of what you're trying to encourage people to do, which is like build community, build two-way communication, build participation, doing this together. So talk to me a little bit about how you think about community building and that element of donor participation.
Sure. So I did a little bit of research because, as you see, that's how I kind of try to understand things. And I came up with this definition that I really liked. So community is when people get together in ways that are participatory, that are purposeful, that are recurring, and that identify leaders. And that felt like it's a definition that people were using in tech, but it felt like something that was very appropriate to the nonprofit works and to the projects and the campaigns that I'd run in this way, which is a very similar model to how we run our boards. I mean, so it's not, we're not reinventing anything. We're maybe just describing it so we can do more of it. So, think of your board or any other good volunteer group, right? It's participatory. They have a say. It's a back and forth, right? It's recurring. So so this is where lots of nonprofits, I feel like they do something really good, but then it's just a once and done. So to build community, you actually have to build in that kind of habit of getting together. And the better way to do, the best way to do that is to say, this is a thing that happens every first Monday of the month, or, just kind of turn it into something. This happened to us in the donor participation project, where I forgot to schedule one of our monthly calls after a while. And people were writing me like, aren't we meeting on Wednesday? And I'm like, what? Was there an expectation about this? So it's it's recurring, it's purposeful. So okay, people can get together, and they get together maybe in groups related to our nonprofit, and lots of nonprofits have kind of what I call either sub communities, shadow communities. People get together. If you have volunteers, if you have alums, patients, if you have audience members, they're going to form their own groups, whether you want it or not, especially now with social media, etc. Right? Your task is to either create ones or try to, influence in a very positive and supportive way the ones that already exist, so that they take some of your purpose, they adopt some of your purpose. And your purpose could be helping students, medical research, ending cancer, ending homelessness, whatever it is. But that purpose is important. Otherwise, it's just people getting together. And that's like lots of times what people fault for in galas, or, where it's just a party. It's not purposeful. And then finally, you identify leaders. So there's always going to be people who want to do more, who lift their hand when you ask for help, who, will go that extra mile, who will lead their own groups, that you can rely on to take the work forward, either growing the community, either making larger gifts. So, this is kind of also where community and major gifts work comes together nicely. So, that's kind of the framework I use to think about whether something is good or bad. So I'll give you an example. We talked about a gala, right? So is it participatory? Nah, maybe a little bit, not, probably the only participation they want is you giving. Is it purposeful? Some of them are, some of them aren't. Good. Is it recurring? Well, usually it's a yearly thing, so that's good. And it builds momentum and people expect it. And does it identify leaders? Some galas are done with a committee, and that type of committee volunteer work is pretty valuable in and of itself. So it meets some, it doesn't meet others. The Donor Participation Project is putting on a learning course / event for fundraisers to learn about gaming fundraising, as in kind of the people that are on Twitch and fundraising, or those communities that get together and raise a ginormous amount of money for a cause. We want to teach people and learn ourselves how to leverage this for every nonprofit. 2/3 of the US population play video games. So probably that's a ton of people in your donor file, and a way to bring new people in. And that meets those characteristics. So is it participatory? A lot, right? You're playing, it's, back and forth. Is it purposeful? Well, that's what we need to crack, right? We need to give it a purpose. It's not just about a playing game. Is it recurring? These people are, I don't want to say addicted, but they're pretty, the people that play. And does it identify leaders? Again, maybe that's the work of the development office, finding your maybe most well-known gamers, or finding community leaders inside this kind of video game communities. So, that's how I try to approach this work. Yeah.
I love it. Okay. Can we talk about the purpose piece for a second? So one thing I wonder, when you were talking about that, something that came up for me is how I feel like I've sat in on a lot of subcommittee meetings where folks were brought together around helping for a gala or helping for this other thing. And it's not a very engaged environment. And there's a lot of kind of repetitive brainstorming meetings and not a whole lot of action. And the development director, I think, feels nervous about holding those volunteers accountable. And that maybe people would leave the committee if there was like a higher level of sort of, requirement. But something that what you said, the reason I was thinking about that based on what you said is like, okay, but if you just have a meeting every month to talk about this issue and keep brainstorming how the group is going to make this, have this impact on the organization. And that never leads to action, or it never leads to fundraising, or it doesn't ultimately lead to a successful event. Then does that break the trust piece around whether or not it's actually purposeful? I'm just curious, like, how you think about that? Like, is purpose in a statement? Is purpose in an action? Is it in the intersection of both of that? What have you seen there?
So something else I discovered building communities is that this kind of ideal that kind of everybody's going to be on equal footage and things are going to happen miraculously is not so accurate. So it's like any business meeting, right? There has to be somebody who's kind of moving things along, and sometimes that development director, me, you're kind of a project manager, but you're just moving things in the right direction. So another thing I kind of told my teams all the time is lead with the purpose. So even if you think that the purpose is clear, people forget it. They're busy. It's, when they meet, they just show up, and, you need to remind them every single time, like what the purpose of this is. And then you need to guide them, people do. And I never found any resistance, you need to guide them toward unintended outcome, and you need to let them know there are deadlines and things to be done. In a way that's not, some people say, well, either do this or you're out. Well, I think there's mileage for, very different approaches, right? But you just need to say, hey, this needs to happen. I mean, it's just not going to happen. And I find that the problems were more kind of on that end of things. The volunteers, they just, they're well-meaning, they're really accomplished, but they also need to kind of be given a little bit of structure.
Yeah. Okay. I really appreciate that.
Does this resonate with kind of the situations you had in your mind?
I would say yes. I think what you said, that's super important there. I liked everything that you said, but I think the thing I would double click on is just that there's not going to be some miraculous output from committees without a driver. And I think some people maybe think that the recruitment of the volunteers was the action they needed to take, and then the ship's going to sail by itself. And so I think just sort of reframing and understanding that that's not actually how these things work. And it's not bad that people are not taking action without your guidance. It doesn't mean that they don't care. Maybe it doesn't even mean that they're not engaged. It just means that they don't have the direction and support that they need actually to continue to sort of play that role. And I love the reminder of purpose. I think there's also something to be said for just starting meetings with a practice that sort of brings everyone back to that purpose, sharing something out that, that reconnects to that purpose. So exactly. I love all of that. Yeah. I love that. Okay. Yeah. An hour just flew by. We could have 4 more of these, but I'm so grateful for your time. Tell everyone where they can find you. Where do you like to connect with folks, and how they can get involved in the donor participation project if they're interested?
You're so kind, Mallory. And we're going to have you back for DPP office hours on LinkedIn. So I'll send you the link after that. If you want to join the donor participation project, it's really easy. Just go to joindpp.org. So joindpp.org. You can sign up there. It's free. Just check it out. You can go there and see the types of events we've had. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. So Luis Diez, Louis Diez. And I look forward to continuing the conversation. Thanks so much, Mallory.
Thank you.